Some leaders leave footprints, others leave libraries. You're tuning into the Authors on Mission podcast, where industry giants become literacy legends. In every episode, we talk with authors who turn their brilliance into books that transform lives. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Welcome to your authorship experience. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Authors on Mission podcast, where we unlock the secrets of successful authors and experts who are transforming their expertise into impactful books and businesses. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission, and today we're going to be talking all about how technical expertise can be translated into accessible, groundbreaking content that serves all readers. So today's guest is Brett Owens. He's a fascinating example of how deep domain knowledge can be transformed into powerful written content. He's the Chief Investment Strategist at Contrarian Outlook and the author of How to Retire on Dividends, Earn a Safe 8% and Leave Your Principal Intact. So he has mastered the art of turning financial concepts into clear, actionable guidance for readers that anybody can kind of pick up and dive right into. So I think that's something really powerful that we're going to learn about today, in addition to all the amazing things you've accomplished in your career as well. So without further ado, Brett, welcome to our show.
Thanks, Danielle. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it's a true honor. I mean, the way that you're able to take such complicated examples of everything you've written and put it into words that everybody can take and understand is just amazing, like I just said in our introduction here. So I'm really excited to dive into that and the strategies that you use to, make your book so accessible to everybody. First things first, though, I think it's important that our audience has a good understanding of who you are, sort of what you do, and where you came from. I gave a little bit of an introduction, but perhaps you could, give us a little bit more detail here. How'd you get into this sort of business?
Yeah, sure, you bet. Well, as you mentioned, today I'm a financial writer. So I write for a website and a newsletter where we make stock recommendations, especially for people who are retired and looking to have their money work for them. How I got into it was a bit of a, circuitous route, maybe as that is often the case. I had a real job after college. I was an engineer at school and then graduated from undergrad and got the day job with the corporate company and didn't like that, and then went to a smaller company and liked that better, and then eventually started my own company. And that was still on the tech side, but what that gave me the opportunity to do was more freedom during the day. So instead of being in meetings, I was able to kind of follow the markets, stocks, commodities, all that kind of stuff that I like. So I could kind of follow the markets, and then I would eventually just started blogging about it. And this is back in the mid 2000s when blogging was kind of the thing. There wasn't as much on social media yet either. You just kind of threw up your blog and some posts. So that's how I got into it, and then stepped my way through. Got hired by a larger newsletter publisher where I was doing some freelance work for them, and then got a real job with a newsletter publisher, and then eventually started my own with a company that was looking to hire a writer. And that was back 10 years ago now, 2015.
Okay, so it's really been quite the journey then. I think what I'd like to kind of circle back to is something I've heard you saying a couple of times, the concept of the real job. So I guess I'm kind of curious. So what about, your first experience in the corporate world made you want to leave what we would define as the typical job and move along to sort of like a more freelance type work? The reason I ask is because a lot of our listeners today, they're successful entrepreneurs just like you who've built up a whole business. And I'm just curious because we also might have audience members who they're self-made. What kind of things inspired you to take that leap?
Yeah, I guess the inspiration was kind of running away from that, having to go to a cubicle every day. I hated everything about the day job, the 8 to 5, having to go to the cubicle, doing work that I thought was boring, acting in a way that wasn't really me, like not being able to talk freely because you get in this corporate world and you work for a Fortune 100 company. Everyone talks different because it's very conservative. You're just trying not to, the name of the game is not offending everyone. And it's just very boring existence. I remember calling my friend from college 2 weeks into it, and we were on opposite coasts. I'd moved to California. He was still in New York, but I asked him, I said, is this the next 30, 40 years of our lives are? I said, this is terrible. So I was always searching for something that would get me out, and anything that I thought would get me out was attractive, whether it was starting my own company. So that entrepreneurial route I always looked at as like kind of the way out of having to do the proverbial hamster wheel for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I understand that completely. I think, anybody listening today can relate to that too. I mean, they might even be listening on their commutes to work when they're going to go sit in those cubicles. But what's really funny is I can see why you really wanted to kind of transfer out of that. For example, I know, not to rat you out, but right now you're standing instead of sitting, which I think is really cool because, you have that freedom to kind of do your work as you please. And sure, a lot of companies probably have standing desks and things like that, but I mean, look at you, you're able to do it the way you want and you're comfortable with it. And I'm sure that's exactly what leads to the most impactful work that you put out there is when you're able to do it on your own terms.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, being able to work comfortably as writers, being able to write comfortably, do your own research, and kind of control your schedule is what we love and why we do it. It's always a challenge to figure out how you can do it and make it economically viable. That's always the key, making the leap, because we all used to love the old entrepreneur magazines where they're working from the back porch on the glass table or overlooking the beach. And in theory, all you need is your laptop and you can take it anywhere and do anything. And that's always very appealing. And then the challenge is always, how do we get this to make it viable in terms of, can we actually make money from doing this?
Right. Yeah, I understand that. So I have a couple of questions kind of branching off of what you just said there. The first one is, we're going to talk about your strategies for making that viable. But before I go into that, I kind of have more of a unique question for you. You mentioned bringing your laptop wherever you want to go. Do you typically travel around with your work?
I do. Yeah. I'll bring my laptop everywhere. I've found it personally easier to not take days off. And I know this might sound terrible, like, geez, you left the corporate world and you can't take days off. But I found it easier just to always have my laptop with me in case I need to do something and just kind of act on whether it's responding to an email or doing a little bit of work here or there. For the holidays, we flew to the Midwest to see our in-laws, other side of the family, and I take my laptop and I write on the plane because why not? So yeah, I always have it nearby so I can do little things. And then with that, maybe you don't have to work. I don't have to sit here 8 to 5 every day. You know what I mean? You can kind of break things up more. I kind of like doing it that way. I'd rather work an hour or two on a weekend, but then, play basketball for a couple hours at lunch. So, there's balances, but I kind of like having the freedom, and I just like being able to stay on top of things. So yeah, I do keep the laptop around.
I think that's actually the best way to go about working, especially in this day and age where, if we have the ability to be so flexible with our work, why not do it on our own terms like we mentioned before? I think it's great that on your planes, you're able to get the work done. I've done the same thing. Last summer, I traveled all over the world and I kind of just took a backpack, took my 3 laptops in that backpack, and we were going all over the place. And wherever I went, I could just set it up in the hotel room or the train that I'm on, and you get the work done so that later on, you can do whatever you want to do. And I think that's amazing about sort of our industry in writing because, we're fortunate enough where it can be done remotely and on a computer, sometimes even the phone, just, pull up the document. So that's awesome that you're able to do that. I guess my next question from you then is kind of just to branch back to what you mentioned before about making the writing viable. I also remember before you mentioned, you talked to your colleague about, how you have to kind of write your talks differently in the corporate world based as opposed to freelancing. So I'm wondering, what do you do to make that writing viable, and how does it differentiate between the corporate and what you do now in terms of like language and content?
Yeah, sure. In terms of consumption, like people being able to understand it.
Yeah, I guess kind of going back to accessibility, but also while maintaining that value in it, making it viable, like you mentioned before.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, good question. I think the important thing is being conversational. You almost want the writing to be a form of like our conversation here, where, it's on paper, but it's the same type of style. It's relatable because in our case, we're conveying concepts and their financial news, stocks, recommendations. We're talking about companies, investments to make. It has to be absorbed by the person who's reading it. So it's similar to a conversation where if instead of writing to that person, we were doing a Zoom and talking about it, or we're doing a podcast, or we're just having a conversation over a coffee or a beer, whatever I'm saying, I want the other person to be able to understand it. So it's better to tone that down from a complexity standpoint and just talk like a normal person versus the corporate speak that we were talking about earlier, where you're almost in that environment. You try to sound smart. You're worried about what other people think. Here, you're really only worried about maybe one person thinks, and that's the person who you're writing for. And of course, we write for more than one person, but it's helpful, I've found, to just think of, hey, who am I talking to here? Come up with an example. This is the person I'm talking to, and I can't talk to them right now, so I need to be able to write this down so that they can read it, they can understand it, they can absorb it, they can relate to it. I may tell a joke because I got to get their attention a little bit, and we want to keep it light because, again, it is like a normal conversation, so we want them to be engaged, entertained, learn something, and kind of convey those concepts. And then with that, that's what helps make it economically viable, where they're getting value from what we're writing, what I'm writing, what they're reading, and then they're going to, in our case, hopefully buy our subscription, renew a subscription.
Right. And, that's exactly how you should go about it, whether it be, with your type of writing for Forbes or your blog posts, but also for any book in general. I think that's something that a lot of our authors listening today could benefit from. I've edited so many different manuscripts that come to me, and I'm looking at the jargon used. And then as the editor, I'm kind of like looking up every word myself, because I've worked with a lot of different kind of topics, but sometimes there's still concepts that just sometimes go over my head a little bit. But as I was looking up some of your stuff here, for example, one of your most recent articles about the 14.3 dividend and how it could to double with Trump, you released that, I believe, only last week, actually. But as I was looking through it, I noticed, you use words like the bummer for us is, and almost like slang, but more so like language that we all use. You didn't just kind of throw jargon after jargon after jargon. You're using that relatable speak that you just mentioned. So just examples like that, like it's such a bummer, right? Like something that we would just say to each other. I think it's an amazing example right there.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I find always if you can shorten the word down, right? It's helpful. So you've got a word and maybe it's longer, and then you look at it like, is there an easier way to say this? Like bummer, right? It's just something that we would say if we're just hanging out, and it doesn't mean we're dumbing down, the whole thing. We're just trying to make it relatable, writing how people talk. So,
yeah, exactly. I actually wrote a blog about that myself, right? It's like, would you rather hear somebody say, "It is greatly unfortunate that this happened," or just say, "It's a real shame, man." So
right.
yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And then there's the whole passive and active voice with that, right? Like your example, it's always a little passive. And I'm sure when you read the jargony things that you edit, that's also, they're written kind of passively, which kind of comes across a little weaker. Like it is a great shame that versus this stinks, or if you do this or you buy this, it's not going to be good, or this company is in trouble, or their profits are in a death spiral or something. So, something that just you picture it and you're like, oh, okay, I'm with you. I can picture it.
Yeah, definitely. And what's interesting too about your field in particular is that it's very number heavy. It's all about math and, percentages. So I think one thing I've noticed as I'm looking through all of your articles and your book is that it's not just a whole paragraph of numbers. You're kind of weaving it into the text. Do you find that challenging at all?
Yeah, definitely challenging. Yes. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's your feedback. Yes, definitely challenging. And in my case, I kind of have a numbers mind that was kind of my background with the engineering. That's why I like this stuff. And I can kind of got the numbers floating around in my head, and I move quick with it. And I do find I got to slow myself down when we're writing, and then also come up with different ways to say it. Like you've got a 4% dividend yield is something we talk about, and then we'll talk about like $1 million portfolio being a nice round number example, but then we want to relate it. Like, what does that mean? Well, 4% of $1 million is $40,000 per year. So it's helpful to, I think, come up with these, ways to describe that, where that's the end result. The reason the person is vesting, they're not actually after the 4%, they're after the 40,000 per year in income. So that's the idea of sort of that end goal. So yeah, thinking of different ways to say it. There's only so many ways you can say dividend, and that's like the cornerstone of our writing, but we say like dividend, payout. I started calling them divvies, and you just need synonyms and just flat out. Otherwise you end up with the same 3 words in one sentence. So just even varying the word type can be challenging. And that's where you kind of got to be a little creative and even bring in the slang and just talk like a normal person. So maybe say dividend first, and then as you're flowing, you can go more of the divvy. Gives you a little change up at least. So yeah, same with the words and the numbers, just trying to not be repetitive from a pure repetition standpoint.
Yeah. As a writer, synonyms are our best friend, right? We don't want to keep repeating the same word over and over, as hard as it might be sometimes. As an editor, that's obviously a huge part of my job. And to anybody listening right now, it's very easy to come up with these kinds of things. Brett here has an engineering background, so he is used to problem solving and coming up with these creative different words for things, right? But if we don't know, what these words might be, these days you can just kind of Google it and be like, what's another way to say dividend? But I like that you came up with divvy, for example. That's one, relatable, two, it's fun, and also a good way for us to remember what it means. And I kind of made a joke before about, okay, you're an engineer, right? I'm wondering, do you think that that kind of problem-solving mindset helps you in the writing process, sort of like finding the right words to put into place?
Yeah, that's a good point. I have started getting into some of the AI tools also to use a tool called Pi.ai, which is, I think, is more geared for writers.
Mm.
And that's a nice one to almost have someone there with you. I never have that. It's always my writing, but I'll have one of these tools open, whether it's Pi or Gemini, and you can ask them like, hey, I need a synonym for dividend, and it'll come up with 5 or 10. And I found something like Pi is even a little better in terms of colloquialisms versus just looking up the thesaurus within the word file. So yeah, I think the problem solving can help from hey, I've got 2,000 words to write, and I'm kind of got this going, but here's what I need: X, Y, and Z, and where are we going to go to kind of complete this and put it all together? And it is kind of exciting with all the tools that we have now available with between the AI stuff or some of these search engines where we can pull different things. So yeah, I think the background is beneficial. I took a class. I mean, this is the origins of Google, so this is the Stone Ages, but we used to look at the Google page rank back when Google was coming out. So it's cool to have that background to kind of think about things and tools that might help in terms of writing. Yeah, the problem solving of like, how do we put this piece together?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great to think that way. I mean, as a writer, sometimes you're just letting your words go onto a page, right? You're inspired and you just like start typing. But like you said, you get stuck. There's writer's block, and I mean, it's great that you have these strategies and these tools and these creative ways to go about getting your ideas out there. And you made a great point. AI can be great for those sorts of things. It's funny, a lot of authors mentioned to me how AI can be used for research or looking things up, but that's actually one thing that I haven't heard as often is just help me find synonyms for this word or, different ways to say that. And I think it's a little bit of a gray area because it's also like, did you come up with that word yourself? Are we being too repetitive? But I'd like to define it as it's a very useful tool, especially if you're not just having it write the whole thing for you, right? So it's a great.
Right. Yeah, I think so. And you can tell when AI is writing stuff because that's a disaster. It's just very boring and plain. It's like, I hope you are well. That's right. So you can tell that. But yeah, I'm in favor of whatever the tools are. I mean, if Pi is going to come up with a list of 10 and I pick them, cool. I was trying to use ChatGPT to name my daughter's basketball team last season. And it helped in terms of like, it came up with 10 names and I went through them, and then I came up with the 11th, which is Taylor Swift, which I thought was like epic for a girls basketball team.
Love it, love it.
Yeah, that's our go-to. But I would not have come up with that if I wasn't reviewing it was not a ChatGPT suggestion, but I had to review those 10, and then that clicked in my head. So I'm in favor of using the tools to brainstorm because I think it's great. And I mean, hey, if they come up with something and I pull it in, I still think it takes. You kind of want that human oversight at the end because it will, if they come up with 10 synonyms, 8 of them you don't like, maybe one you like, one's okay, maybe you think of a different one. So I still think that there's still a big part of that human judgment going in. But yeah, I'm in favor of using them to the extent that they come up with new ideas. That's what I'm all for. But in terms of, actual writing, I haven't seen anything promising in terms of like, I would let you write a sentence for me. But in terms of like a list of synonyms, seems pretty easy.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I mean, a lot of authors come to me these days with those AI written manuscripts, and it has come up on a lot of my podcasts as well about, just the delicate balance between using it as a tool and using it to actually write your work. And it's funny because as an engineer, you probably understand this. Like the concept of AI, like in my opinion, is kind of just a paradox in itself because like it's taking from the internet the content that it's using to put out to you. So it's almost like it's giving you the same content that's already out there when you're asking it to write for you. So it's naturally kind of be repetitive of somebody else's. I just always think that's interesting to think about if you try to actually use it for writing.
That's a great point.
Right. Sidebar there, but
yeah, it's a great point. No, it's just recycling. It's making judgment calls on what's out there. I remember when the tools came out, and they were joking that on this tech podcast I listened, we would be pining for the good old days of 2021 internet before it had all this AI stuff out there. So yeah, I think that's a good point that that's not necessarily what you want. I was playing around with Gemini. I was bored yesterday, or I wasn't bored, but I was writing an article, and then I was using it for research, and then I actually asked it to write something in my own tone. So I said, can you write this like Brett Owens from Contrarian Outlook? I want to see what it would come up with. And it didn't do bad. Like it had some colloquialisms and did okay. It's
Do
not
you use
something that I would copy and paste and put my name to, or really do anything other than just read it. But I think in terms of the spirit, it did okay on that. But it wouldn't. If you put it side by side and I showed you'd be able to pick out the real one.
Yeah, 100%. A little bit of like a sidebar that we just took right there, but I think it does have a lot of relevancy to, how to make complex topics like what you talk about relatable to others, because it's another tool that you can use to, well, I guess funny enough to say, to humanize the writing by using an AI tool to give you those solutions for easier ways to say things. So kind of just another tip that we can offer to our listeners right there. I guess I'm curious, we've talked about, using accessible language. We've talked about using synonyms. Do you have any other sorts of tips right now that you might think of in terms of making it more accessible to the readers? I know a lot of people use stories in their writing. I'm not sure if that's something you typically do in your book, but do you have any other sorts of tips you might be able to share with us?
Yeah, stories are a great one. We don't do them. We didn't do them as much in the book, but I do them a lot in articles where that's something that's very, again, just kind of connecting with the reader. My parents read it. They love the stories with the kids. Sometimes that's all they remember from the story. But it's nice to be able to. Now you do have to be able to make it. There's got to be like a legit connection. And that's something that I find sometimes is challenging to newer writers when we'll be training people and say, okay, well, this is good analysis, but can you do a story to make it more relatable? And then there's a story in the piece, but they're almost separate. So you do have to. That's kind of a trick, I think, to have the connection. But I do think stories are great. I think illustrations are very good also, because a lot of people, my theory is that they're skimmers and they kind of skim, right? Everyone's on the internet, and whether it's an article, especially online based things. So our reports, our newsletters, I would love to think that everyone reads all 2,000 words of a newsletter, but I accept that a lot of them open and they're skimming, and they may be skimming multiple times up and down, and then maybe they'll dive in to read. But I kind of look at it like, hey, this thing has to be digestible from a skimmable standpoint. So we're looking at the headlines. So we've got, sub headlines within there. And then the illustrations, I take some time to draw arrows on the charts to things that are important. And we got a little cursive note that we put on there. And then I always do a chart title, something that you're showing someone, but you're also telling them what the takeaway is within that. And again, that's just to make it easier for people who are skimming, who are moving fast, is online today. So I think we just have to acknowledge this is how people are reading, especially when they're on a screen. And we're all used to scrolling like crazy.
Yeah.
And
it's easy to do thumb and just swipe up on the article.
Swipe up, right? Doom scrolling, right? We're part of the doom scroll. You got to be able to digest. So it almost needs to play two ways, where if someone reads every word, it's good. But also if someone reads the headlines and pictures and the titles, it's got to kind of hold together from that standpoint also.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And it's interesting because, a lot of authors wouldn't think that the images have as big as a role to play as they do. But like you just mentioned, it truly does, because not only is it something that they can help understand the content better, but it draws your eye to it more. I mean, if I asked anybody on the street, would you rather read this book or this book? And one has a couple diagrams and pictures and one is just paragraphs of straight text. More than likely, without even thinking about the content, they'd probably go to the pictures because they're thinking, okay, it's more accessible, it's more engaging. So, right off the bat, that's, just an amazing tip right there. And I feel like it's also more memorable too. I mean, you're more likely to remember that image than the block of text. So it helps them keep picking up your book and going back to your writing, and just a whole nother, avenue right there.
Yeah, exactly. Another dimension to it. Keep them kind of something to reference. I know when I get books, it's always that, am I going to do it on my Kindle or get a physical book? And if it's all text, I'll do the Kindle because it's all the same. But if there's pictures and things I want to actually absorb, it'll be the physical book. So I think that's the case there. It does take time to do the pictures because like in my case, I'll get a chart, but I don't want it to look like every other chart out there. So then I do my markups. So then I have a designer who helps with that aspect because I'm not good at designing, and then she'll kind of make the fonts bigger and more accessible to our readers. Also, we have a lot of older readers, so you just got to be kind of cognizant of this stuff, where just make stuff larger, make it easier to digest. Font size is large, put the takeaways there, arrows and such. This is another thing. Hopefully, maybe AI will be able to help with in the future. I haven't had much luck with it yet in terms of directing. Hey, can you do a chart like this with an arrow here or there? Maybe years down the road, we'll see.
Yeah, I've heard that I can make charts, but I don't quite know how good they are yet. But the way things are moving these days, who knows by next year what it'll be able to do. But sort of branching off what you said before about how in your book there's not as many stories, I think that's a great segue to your book. So I'm wondering, do you mind holding up the copy for us?
Yeah, of course.
That cover?
Yeah, here we go.
All right, well, check that out, everybody. How to Retire on Dividends. Can you explain that cover? Is that a golden egg and a nest, isn't it?
Yeah, good. Yeah, golden nest egg here. My daughter used to call it Daddy's Easter egg book because you ever got the egg. So yeah, we did the golden egg in there, and that's the idea, is that this is your nest egg, and we want to keep the nest egg and then turn it into a dividend stream, and then we got the 8% number. That's our target dividend from the newsletter. So turn that 8% on the nest egg and generate the cash flow.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, as much as we like to say, don't judge a book by its cover, seeing a golden egg is bound to draw some eyes, thinking, hey, maybe this will give me some tips for making my own golden egg. I'm sure, did you have a big part to play in making that design?
I did. Fortunately, my co-author, Tom Jacobs, this is my first book. Tom's written multiple books before. So he was a veteran. He kind of walked us through the whole process of it. So it was great. So I'll give Tom all the credit. I did kind of talk through it with him, but we used he had a book designer who kind of had a few concepts. And
gotcha.
I think we kind of had some ideas. So yeah, it was a brainstorm, and then we saw this. And definitely
good. Yeah.
run with this one.
The reason I ask is because sometimes authors, they finish their book and then they're handed it to the publisher, and then I heard somebody tell me the other day that they didn't even know what their cover was going to look like until it hit the shelves. And I was like, how? It's supposed to be something you're really involved in, you put a lot of thought into. I mean, Authors on Mission, that's something we do when we're publishing, is the author actually goes through a whole series of steps. You have people who kind of bid for the cover design. They design it for you. You get to choose between it. So just something I figured I'd ask and see, because I love that design. So it's cool to know that you did have a lot of intention into it.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have known what to do on my own. So, I mean, that's a great service that you provide. Because if I was writing it myself, I wouldn't have known where to start with the self-publishing. And maybe having an experienced co-author helped us get through that.
Yeah, well, I'm noticing now that we're talking more about the book, is you actually had a whole team of people with you, didn't you? You had the designer who helped with the graphics, you had a co-author, you had the designer for the book as the cover as well. So, and what I'm noticing is that you worked with a team to write this book, which is perhaps something that our audience could also learn from, because as much as you might want to write it by yourself, you might need that additional help. Did you decide, was there a certain reason why you decided not to go on your own, or just kind of fall into the team aspect? I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, so Tom I work with on the newsletter. He's actually my editor. So he's the guy who, when I use a word 3 times in a paragraph, highlights it like you do for your authors, and he'll just kind of highlight it. Sometimes he won't even leave a note. He'll just highlight it and say, this is that. But we work together closely on the newsletter, and he's done the books before. So yeah, I think we had talked about doing a collaborative effort on the book, and one of those things where it's more based on my writing. So it was something where I had to do the legwork in terms of putting the words together and on the page, and then he's helping to formulate that into a book and helping coach me, like, hey, this is different from the online world, so here's what we need to do in terms of the book. And then from a designer standpoint, I think we both agreed that we wanted the picture component, the graphs, because those are important in the on the website and in the newsletter. My designer who does the pictures there, she wasn't comfortable doing those for the book. We needed black and white and just something. So we hired someone else, and that was a big process because we ended up with 41 graphs and charts, and that ended up being a lot of back and forth in terms of me trying to explain. I think it was someone overseas that we hired, so me trying to explain these American terms, and no, we need the arrow exactly here. So it's very tedious. It's one of those things when you're done, you're happy you're done. But yeah, definitely a team effort on that side. But what was more important to me was getting the book out and having a high quality product. So whatever it took in terms of that, I think the team approach was the most natural way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it also depends on sort of what your needs are. I mean, you wanted to make sure that it was out and that it was high quality. That's sometimes what you need is to kind of reach out to people who've done it before, know what they're doing, or, maybe just bouncing ideas back and forth off of each other too. Like if they're co-authors, just another amazing way to go about bringing it from idea to completion. So amazing things right there. I guess I'm also curious, you mentioned before, it was different than writing a blog as opposed for a book. What made you go, and what was the moment when you realized that you wanted to move on and write that book, take that leap?
Yeah, the motivation is there online. There's no barriers to entry. There's a lot of copycats online, so I could write something in my in a website article, and you'll see, and especially in our newsletter, and it'll be popular, and it'll resonate well, and then 3 months later you can have and I would see this, you would have other people who are writing basically the same thing. There's nothing to protect your work per se online. Not that they're copying and pasting, not that they're plagiarizing per se, but they're definitely taking your ideas and even some phrases, and they'll just move it over here, and now they're using it in their stuff. And there's no way to, I would say, effectively prevent that from happening versus having a book, which is really a whole new barrier to entry. So we can write things on dividends online, and we can try to stay ahead of trends and accept that there's copycats out there. But having a book, and we really want it to be like the authoritative book, that was something that was definitely a step above and gives you this competitive differentiation where not only do we have the spots on our site and on Forbes, but also this book, and it's on Amazon. It's got 733 reviews and whatnot, but it gives you that extra level of credibility, and I think protects your IP from, honestly, a lot of copycats, which is what the online world unfortunately is.
Brett, I'm loving that you brought that up because, I've interviewed a lot of authors, and a lot of the times when I ask them, okay, like, why did you write your book? They have amazing responses like, I found a need that had to be filled, or I was just really inspired by this, or I know a lot about this topic. And, that applies to you, tenfold for your book. But the angle that you just took with your answer is something I haven't yet heard. The idea of protecting your own words so that they don't get copyrighted. And I love that even more because the funny thing is I'm actually writing a blog article myself on copyrights this week. So it's funny because I was just literally researching about copyright laws, and then you brought that up. So I guess I'm curious. I haven't dived in too much about the laws, but I know that a lot of work can just become copyrighted as soon as you put it onto a page. The definition that I found right here and I pulled up is your original work receives copyright protection the moment it is created and fixed in a tangible form that is either directly or with the aid of a machine or device. So I guess that's an interesting thing that I'll have to dive into myself. I feel like your blog posts would be copyrighted, but I wonder, what made you think the blog posts wouldn't be as protected as the book? In theory, both could be at risk, right? So,
right. I think with the blogs, it's just a matter of how do you enforce it. So if you've got someone who's on another website and it's like, hey, that was kind of my idea, and now you're writing about it, how do you enforce that? Are you going to send
then
them?
I just delete that message, right? Not even.
Right. So how do you get them to, you could send a cease and desist? I mean, if you start getting a lawyer involved, now your costs are potentially really high, and that's almost like I agree with you. Like you may have some copyright protection, but then in terms of the enforcement side, it could be kind of like a never-ending thing. Like you're playing internet cop, right? Trying to chase everyone down, and that's a kind of a tiring and maybe an expensive existence. So not that you can't do it, but I think that it would get expensive pretty quickly versus at least having the book. There was a pure copycat that came out, and they published an ebook version. It was word for word exactly our book.
What? Really?
Yeah, it was kind of hilarious how it had a different title. Otherwise, it was exactly like plagiarized our book, and it was like an online version. I think it was a Kindle version, and that was an easy one to get.
So how did you find out about that, and what did you do?
Tom found it. I don't remember how it came up or how he found it, but it was just out there on the dividend side, and yeah, it was just a straight which is a straight copycat book. And I think it was through Amazon, if I'm not mistaken, that he went through Amazon, and then basically they were able to they took it down.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, hey, that's a word of caution out there to our listeners right now, right? Like, you need to be on the lookout for that sort of thing. If your book's published, and you have especially the copyrights in place, I mean, you still need to be on guard for that because, wow, like if you didn't have your eye out, you would have maybe not even ever realized
Right.
that.
It's still up to you
Yeah.
to find it and get it, because nobody's looking out. It was not an automated Amazon like, hey, we found this plagiarized copy. It was us that found it. So that's a great point. It's got to be up to you.
Okay, yeah, and not to go too much off on a sidebar of the copywriting, I'd like to go more into the details of your book as well, but I do have one more question about that, just for my own curiosity. How did you go about getting that official copyright protection? This is probably a question that a lot of our listeners might be wondering too. That you're writing your book, did your publisher go ahead and, take care of that for you? Did you take any steps on your own to make sure it was copyrighted?
Yeah, we took steps on our own. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, and it was almost 6 years ago now, but I think we went through my attorney, helped with that, helped file that with I forget who it goes through, is it the USPTO or someone else, but it's pretty straightforward process. So yeah, we did that on our own since we self-published.
Understood. Yeah. In my blog, I'm going to research ways into how, if you want to self-publish and you don't want to go to an attorney, some methods you can take and some steps. So I'd like to balance that perspective. So to all of our listeners, be on the lookout for that blog as well. But I think that's an amazing tip. Like, you need integrity in your own words is something that a lot of us might be thinking about. But in my own mind, it wasn't at the forefront, right? So that's something we should always kind of be on guard for. As much as we think it's out there and people are buying your book, it might not be safe for anybody else who want to take it. So it's something to think about. Now, diving into the content of your book a little bit more, you referenced a lot of different stocks and trades in your book. So I'm wondering, you kind of make hold on, where was I here? I made a little note to myself about the different stocks that you mentioned. You talked about how you argue against using Coca-Cola and Johnson and Johnson, and I guess I'm curious, like, where did these concepts come from? Did it take a lot of research to make these points? And if you could also just maybe give us a little bit more of a background information about sort of why you came up with that approach.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of our concepts come from our newsletter and our online articles, so we basically took those and then kind of put it into the book form, but of course writing it as if, hey, maybe this person hasn't read anything from us yet, so we've got to kind of introduce these concepts. Now, where the idea or the approach comes from, it's something we observe that it's kind of being done by individual investors, and I guess that the lesson there is it's better to find something people are already doing, and then you can kind of write to that and maybe have different recommendations. And what they're doing today, or who we write for, I would kind of give it's a subset of the retiree world. Income investors would be the term, and these are people who typically they've worked their whole lives, whether they've had their own companies or they've worked corporate jobs or they're in dentists or whatever. They've saved their money throughout their lives, and now they're approaching retirement or in retirement, so 60 or 65 or 70, and they don't want to work anymore. They want to get ready so that they're not going to work anymore, and that big pile of money has to turn into steady cash flow, right, to replace the paycheck that they had, and then they're going to use the dividend income and some Social Security money, and that's how they're going to fund their retirement years. From the Coca-Cola and J&J's example to maybe the higher dividend stocks that we talk about, I think where that comes from is that your average person maybe has in that $500,000 to $1 million or more range of saved money. So if they go to a blue chip, quote unquote, blue chip company, or you're buying the S&P 500 index, you're getting maybe 1.5% or 2% in yield today. So that's only going to be a 2% number. That would be $20,000 annually on $1 million. So that's probably less than the person was making their whole lives, right? And that's going to be a big income hit. So then the question is, well, how do you make up that, difference? There are some rules out there like, hey, you can withdraw 4% and still kind of be okay with it. Or do you want to look for a dividend stock that pays more, pays 5 or 6% to increase your income. So that's an interesting approach, and it can work. And that's the one that we use for our main newsletter. But it comes with risks also, where we want to make sure that these are safe. A lot of times higher dividends are because they're perceived as not being safe. So there are opportunities there, and you kind of got to be a contrarian, and that's our website, Contrarian Outlook, is because you need to think differently to be able to find these, but you also need to do your research to make sure that they're safe in that. So that's the overall approach. It's kind of a popular one that doesn't get talked about, I guess, a lot in the mainstream, but when people find out, especially friends who are getting close to retirement, they're like, oh, you're a writer? And like, oh, that's exactly my problem. Is like, I've got this nest egg and I have no idea what to do with it. So, and I'm looking at dividend stock. So there's already a class of people who are looking for this stuff. And then we just provide the research to hopefully help them invest smartly with it.
Okay, perfect. So, in terms of like what our listeners might be taking from this today is sort of, you were able to find the content of your book and what had to be approached sort of just based on what your existing audience was looking for from your blog articles, right? These different strategies for, ensuring that they're investing properly and doing the right things with their nest egg. And for example, you just mentioned the 4% withdrawal fallacy, which is something you kind of talked about in your book as well. So I'm assuming that's probably something you had already covered a little bit in your blog post and then just kind of dove deeper in for this book. Would that be correct to say?
Yeah, exactly. It's a great way to do it. Is as I'm talking with Tom about, hey, how do we need to outline the book, and it is funny because then it kind of morphs as you get into it, because you start writing it and you're like, how do we want to structure this thing? But that's exactly it. And then you say, well, let's lead with the other approaches, and what are the other approaches? The popular ones, 4% rule, and we did an article here, and then we can reference that, so we can kind of pull some ideas from that or use that as, into your point, expand upon it in the book form, because we want to do the background, and then we want to make sure we're referencing other things that we referenced in the book. So that's kind of keep it a steady flow through there. But yeah, generally it was very helpful having a history of articles that we were able to pull from, or at least gives you ideas in terms of, we wrote about this before. And then in our case, we also have online stats and metrics, which are helpful, because you can say, oh, hey, this piece is really popular, so this is something that we need to include in the book. That is the nice thing about online, is you're able to see that, like, hey, we got tons of views on this, or this article sold a ton of newsletters, and this is just always popular every time we run it.
It's great that you mentioned that approach. That's a very actionable step that our authors could do like right now, is to look at their existing content and see, okay, which of my posts is most popular, which of my videos had the most views, right? So taking from those concepts and then expanding on that is a good way to ensure that whatever it is you put in your book is reaching the biggest audience that it possibly can. I love that you did that. And what I'm kind of noticing in the way you describe your book is that you took it and you kind of found not just different ways to explain the concept, but also just things that other people might have missed. Like, for example, when I was reading through it a little bit, you mentioned that Walmart had a 118% payout ratio and how it was concerning, but that's something that you had mentioned not a lot of people recognize. So that's something that, you were able to put in your book that maybe we didn't already know. Would that be correct in saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's sort of something that we debated with the book, is you want to make it as evergreen as possible, right? So you can look at the Walmart example today, and that's kind of the idea, is like, hey, Walmart at the time had this payout ratio that we believe was
unsustainable. It's not the same anymore then, is it?
Exactly, because now that was the 2019 payout ratio, now it's 2025, and it's a moving target. And then you've got different payout ratios, and someday, Walmart may not even be around. I mean, that's, we're talking decades in the future, but that's just how business and finance works. So you have these examples from a pure example standpoint, they go cold almost as immediately as you publish the book, because everything moves. The stock market is open every day, the prices move. Walmart's payout ratio moves maybe every quarter when they report, so every 3 months. So these things are just always moving. So we try to give the example of, if you see a stock with this type of payout ratio, and find it better to have a concrete example, like this was Walmart at this time with this payout ratio. So fast forward to 2025, you can find a different stock with that payout ratio, and then it's the same example and it's still relevant. But it is the tricky part about finance. It's great online because readers are constantly consuming our content because we publish today, it gets obsolete very fast, as is everything that gets published out there. And so it's always changing, and there's always this demand for new information, which is great online, very challenging for a book, right? Because we're trying to write that. And then give examples. I don't want to just be nebulous. We want to give concrete examples, but then we're trying to also be evergreen about it, as evergreen as we can, and have it still be relevant today, even though the numbers are going to be different.
Well, I think you just opened a whole new can of worms here, the evergreen concept, right? Because that's so funny because Walmart just kind of popped out to me when I was looking at your book, like, okay, like seems to be a great example of something other people didn't notice in the content, but then you were like, yeah, that's not quite relevant anymore. So it's funny because that's another thing that our authors need to think about when they're writing their books to make it evergreen so that people want to keep reading your book even like 10 years from now. You offered a lot of good examples of how to deal with this. I'm wondering, and I'm curious, if you could go back now and sort of change the book to make it more evergreen, what might you have done? I mean, of course, you still want to use that Walmart example, but do you have any tips about how you can do that while still making it relevant 10 years down the road?
Yeah, good question. I think what I would do differently, if I think about like the introduction, is very based on current levels from the Federal Reserve, is what we use. So it's based on a current situation that has since changed over the last 5 years. So I would have tried to make that more evergreen from the introduction. Like, there are things that I think will still be out there 10 years from now, like that 4% rule. That's just kind of a general rule that financial advisors say, like, hey, you can take 4% of your savings. So that's something that they'll probably be saying 10 years from now, right? Versus if you look at a specific interest rate, a specific point in time, probably not a good idea to put that early on in a book, because that's one of these things that's going to move around ultimately. So yeah, I think looking through that lens, that's what I would have done different, is making, especially with like the introduction. I think when you get into examples and case studies, you have more leeway in a book like ours. Like, you have to have examples and having those, the concrete numbers in. I think I'm not sure if there's another way to do it, but basically thinking about that intro part is really what evergreen different.
So speaking sort of my lens as a editor and an angel writer, we call ourselves angel writers rather than ghostwriters here at Authors on Mission. But speaking from that lens and what I've, experienced in other books, I'm wondering if you would agree, if you had perhaps even just said like, no, this particular statistic might not be relevant in this later on, but it was when I wrote this book, or perhaps a footnote to kind of warn the readers, like, look for more relevant data when you're reading it. I'm wondering, would that sort of been maybe an approach that you could have taken?
Yeah. I think with us, you almost would have had to do a blanket at the start with that. I mean, maybe that would have been worth a sub chapter, because otherwise we would have been footnoting the whole thing, because everything it's just crazy how everything changes. So I think that could have been worth maybe
maybe like a disclaimer, like
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, like maybe that's something our listeners can kind of take with them today if they're writing their own books of similar content, is just a little disclaimer saying these theories are valid, this is what we've noticed, however some of the examples might be outdated, there's more relevant ones now, that sort of thing. It's something to think about, because
I think that's great. Yeah, I would definitely recommend that. I think it's a great idea for readers with similar, or writers similar types of books. Just letting me know. That's exactly your point. Like, hey, the theories, the practices are still applicable, is 100% what I would go with. That's great.
Yeah, what I'm loving about this conversation, Brett, is that a lot of the topics that we're talking about are unique, because I think it must be that, engineering and math brain of yours, as opposed to the writers that I always talk about, because we always talk about what's inspiring us in our writing process, and, which I love and our listeners love too. But these are sides that are more like practical and things you actually need to think about. Like, is my book going to be relevant 10 years from now? Is somebody going to copy my content? How do I protect myself from these pitfalls that could happen? Just very like practical things that I think a lot of us, when we start to write a book, again, might not be in the front of our mind. This is so important for our listeners to hear right now. So I really appreciate this. I think this is very valuable.
Oh, it's awesome. Yeah, glad to hear it. Yeah, it's all stuff I kind of maybe wish I would have known earlier, or just, you don't know until you do it, that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best way to go about it, is learning from not a mistake, because clearly your book was highly successful and taught a lot of people what they need to know. But areas to keep in mind moving forward. And I guess, speaking of moving forward, what's sort of on the horizon for you right now? Have you thought about writing a more updated version of the book or any other projects that you're working on right now?
We always kick that around. Haven't had the stomach to go for it yet. We've thought about doing a book on our other strategies. I have another strategy that's more focused on dividend growth and a whole newsletter dedicated to that. And I think that would be very deserving of its own book. But other than kicking around titles and concepts, yeah, we just haven't gotten all the way into that one. We've enjoyed kind of running down the inventory on this book. I guess one more tip is that we printed 10,000 hard copies without thinking about the Kindle and electronic component. And we've sold way more electronically than we have in physical form. So we've worked down the hard copy. We're under 2,000 now copies in the warehouse, but we sold so many more online and then in the Audible version that I think we had to do over again. Again, that initial print would have been the 5,000 instead of the 10,000. But other than that, yeah, we're just still the newsletter, keeping us busy. So those get published monthly. There's a couple that get published on a monthly basis, and then always writing for the website. So those are articles going out every day on the website.
Yeah, I was actually surprised when I looked at that most recent one on Trump. I was like, wait, this was only like a couple of days ago. Like, you're really just active with it. And, in a way, I guess that also goes back to being evergreen. You just have to keep getting new, fresh content out there, and, online platforms is the way you can do it. So thanks for, bringing that up too. And yeah, I mean, word to the wise, don't print 10,000 copies of your book unless, people are going to want to pick up hard copies. It's really funny. But I mean, you never know, right? And now you have that. And, which I'm sure you already do, you can always take those books and kind of use it as like your personal business card now. Like, you have that hard copy, you hand it to like your next client or whoever you're talking to, like, take this is some strategy you can use. I mean, it's not like your books aren't valuable now that they're in print. You can always use them, is what I guess I'm trying to say, even if it's
right. Great point. Yeah. The hard copies are nice because they're just very professional and they're the best business card.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, I guess considered all this and wrapping it all up today, where can we go to find you? I know that I mentioned before your book can be found on Amazon. You have daily articles coming out for Forbes, and you also have ContrarianOutlook.com. Do you have any other ways that our audience might be able to get in touch with you if they're interested in learning more about what you do and your theories?
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, we do have a book website also. So that's howtoretireondividends.com. So that's where we also have the book, and you can download a first chapter. So it would be a PDF as well. And that'll get you on our book email list. And then ContrarianOutlook.com does have a daily sign up also. So you can sign up. There's a free daily newsletter sign up there.
Awesome. Yeah. So to all of our listeners who, loved hearing Brett talk, you not only can read his book, but also get emails from him from multiple different platforms. That's really cool too. You don't even need to look up when a new blog is posted. It'll come right to you. That's really good to know, especially because everything that you're writing about is changing every day. You kind of have to be up to date with this as the reader too, to stay informed. So I'm glad that you have that. That's something our listeners should go ahead and subscribe to right now. In fact, guys, pause this podcast right now and go ahead and subscribe, and then come back to read the ending of our podcast right now. So yeah, I mean, thank you for that. Any last words of wisdom to leave our audience with today?
Well, I think just writing is great. So wherever you're at, if you can just, I'm sure you're thinking about what the next step is, and I would just kind of encourage you to go for it. So whether it's, hey, I got to start something, and just getting out there on the blog, I think just getting the reps in has been very useful for me. And then you kind of go to the next step. So wherever you're at in terms of the process, if you've been thinking about writing the book forever, like I did forever before doing it, then it's always that action that kind of gets you there. So I think just whether it's setting up the blog and just writing there, or you think, hey, I should be writing more, well, just make it a regular thing where you're writing daily or weekly on it. If you're, kind of haven't always wanted to start the book, but you're not there yet, again, if you can just do it, set aside some time, do a little every day, a little every week, I think that really helps. But just kind of keep inching towards, because I know I've been there in terms of like, oh, I want to do this someday. But to get to the someday, I found doing just setting the goals and getting into it, and whether it's a daily or weekly progress, then that's what will ultimately get you there versus, keep talking about the stuff where I know it's a lot of work, so I can appreciate that. So just kind of breaking it up was helpful to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I say all the time. If you have an idea, even if you're just bouncing it around in your head, it's never going to be more than an idea if you don't just take that first step. So, I mean, maybe we can leave our audience with a little bit of homework today. First off, go sign up for your newsletters. And then after that, set aside 15 minutes at your laptop and just type out the first couple paragraphs of whatever book it is that you have in mind, even if it's something that won't even be to completion yet. At least you have that document open that you can get started, right? It's the first step. So, I mean, hey, thank you again. This has been a really insightful conversation, and it's topics that we don't always talk about, but we really need to know about, especially in the practical aspect of writing a book. So I really appreciate that. It's been very insightful for all of us, I think. So thank you for joining us. And to all of our listeners, thank you for being a part of another episode of Authors on Mission podcast. If this conversation sparked your author journey, remember, your knowledge deserves to be shared. Just like Brett just said, start writing. Just put your first foot forward and do whatever you can to get it started, because otherwise it's not going to be published. So listeners, join us next time as we continue helping leaders just like you transform their knowledge into impact. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. This is Brett Owens, and you can find his books on Amazon, his articles on Forbes. And everybody, until next time, keep writing, keep leading, and keep inspiring. Have a great day. Thanks for listening. This is Danielle Hutchinson reminding you that somewhere, someone needs the book that only you can write. Visit authorsonmission.com to start your legacy. Until next time, keep leading, keep inspiring, and keep thinking in chapters. Have a great day.